The D-Day landings had taken Hitler by surprise. But 7 weeks on, the Germans had reinforced their defences and successfully contained the Allied beachhead. The Allies were bogged down in heavy fighting across Normandy and needed to get inland to begin the liberation of France. It would be a fierce and bloody journey against a tenacious enemy in a challenging landscape.
You felt as though it was like a continuous death sentence, that if you went to sleep at night, you wouldn't. Next day would be the last day.
This is the story of the Normandy Breakout. By 1944, after 4.5 years of war, Nazi Germany was under pressure from all sides. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army had launched a gigantic offensive in Byelorussia. In Italy, the Germans had abandoned Rome and were retreating north. While in Normandy, in northern France, following the hard-fought success of D-Day, the Allies had landed almost 1 million troops. The war might be moving in the Allies' favour, but 7 weeks on from D-Day, their forces were still bottled up in Normandy. They had to find a way to break out and get the so-called Second Front moving, or risk becoming a sideshow to the Red Army's great offensive in the east. But any advance inland was going to be difficult for the Allies.
Once the Germans had realized that D-Day was the main landing and there would not be a second landing, the Germans had moved reinforcements into that particular part of France. And on paper, the German forces look particularly strong. So they have 7 tank divisions. They have a very large concentration of Waffen-SS divisions, which by that stage, most of them can be seen as elite forces with very heavy equipment. So on paper, a very, very strong force.
By mid-July, British and Canadians were locked in a brutal slugging match around the city of Caen. And it would fall to US First Army under General Bradley to attempt the desperately needed breakout. The 51-year-old Omar Bradley was a former head of the US Army Infantry School at Fort Bragg, who'd overseen the creation of America's 1st Airborne Division, the 82nd. Having commanded a division and then an army corps during the Allied landings in North Africa and Sicily, he was given command of US First Army for the invasion of Europe. He was accustomed to working closely with Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower, his former West Point classmate.
Omar Bradley was a pretty solid general. He was tough, smart, and experienced. But he was methodical and perhaps a little bit slow. And as commander of the 1st American Army, he was also subordinate to General Bernard Montgomery, and their relationship wasn't the best. Montgomery often felt like he was getting blamed for Bradley's slowness.
Allied attacks by British Second Army around Caen had drawn the bulk of German forces off in that direction. The German line opposite US First Army was therefore relatively weakly held. Bradley planned to launch a powerful attack on a narrow front near the town of Saint-Lô, using heavy bombers and artillery to blast a hole in the German line. American infantry and tanks would then pour through the gap, capture Avranches, and secure a route out of Normandy. The British and Canadians would simultaneously launch another major attack around Caen, pinning down German divisions so they couldn't be moved to face Bradley's attack. The Allies had total control of the skies over Normandy, allowing their aircraft to bomb, strafe, and rocket German ground forces at will, with almost zero risk of interference from the once mighty Luftwaffe. Josef Schröder was a German machine gunner who had fought on Omaha Beach.
Wir werden das nicht vergessen, wie deprimierend das für uns war. Wir konnten nichts dagegen machen. Es war nicht ein einziger deutscher Jäger am Himmel. Oder dass die Flak geschossen wird. Nichts.
A rather grim joke told by the Germans at the time was aircraft recognition. You look up, and if the underside of the aircraft above you is painted silver, it's American. If it's painted black, it's British. And if it doesn't show up at all, it's German.
The Allies might have complete control of the skies, but on the ground, the terrain favoured the Germans, who were now entrenched in Normandy's Bocage landscape. Bocage country was made up of small fields, about 100 or 200 metres square, bounded by earth banks with hedges on top. Cecil Newton was a tank gunner who came ashore on D-Day.
The terrain of the Bocage, no one knew about it beforehand. No one knew about the deep lanes, the high hedges. Hadn't got a clue, and it came as a great shock.
Die Straßen sind ja von beiden Seiten mit hohen Büschen, waren die ja überdeckt, also diese Straßenrinnen, ne? Die waren überdeckt und die Straßenrinnen waren ziemlich tief. Die waren 1,20 Meter, waren manchmal noch mehr. Also die waren schon ein guter Schutz für uns. Wir haben uns dann immer da reinfallen lassen, aber wenn er dann treffen sollte, dann sind sie auch schon mal quer drüber geflogen. Oder die Hohlwege zum Beispiel, da sind ja unheimlich viele Hohlwege. Und die waren von oben ja nicht einzusehen, weil die Bäume alle oben zugewachsen waren. Da war man wie in einem Tunnel.
American troops also struggled in the giant hedgerows.
Some of them were up 4, 5, 6 feet high, and each field was completely surrounded. So in effect, what you had to do, you had to fight your way from one hedgerow to the next.
What the Germans have got is a naturally occurring trench system. They can use the hedgerows to move men down, and they can use the churches, the farmhouses and so on as strong points. And this ground has to be fought over very much like the trench systems of the First World War. And for some Americans who had served in the Pacific, it reminded them of fighting through the jungle.
But some Allied units also learned to take advantage of the terrain.
Hedgerows worked both ways. It was very difficult pushing forward in the hedgerows, but by the same token, you had about as much cover as the enemy did, and so you were protected. Well, I'd say a good bit at a time, you were protected.
Invasion planners thought Allied troops would push through the hedgerows and into open country within a few days of landing. The US 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions faced some of the worst terrain around Saint-Lô, which had to be captured before General Bradley could launch his attack, codenamed Operation Cobra. On D-Day, the 29th had received a bloody baptism of fire on Omaha Beach. Now, they faced a different kind of hell. Any road or pathway could be mined or covered by concealed enemy positions.
In the Bocage, you had to be careful where you walked. You had to be very cautious, you had to stay spread apart. As an infantryman, you had to use great judgment.
The Americans would have to improvise ways to break through the dense hedgerows. But it wouldn't be easy.
We had Bangalore torpedoes for barbed wire. You don't blow hedgerows with a thing. You're talking about a mini mountain that's been growing for a couple of centuries of land that the Normans have been using.
So, in US Armored Division workshops, engineers began using the thousands of leftover German beach obstacles to weld crude steel tusks to their tanks. The Americans nicknamed them rhinos.
It kind of looked like a long rake, upside down. Of course, it weighed probably a ton.
With their modified tanks leading the charge, American troops began fighting their way through the hedgerows towards Saint-Lô. But constant German ambushes inflicted a huge toll on frontline units.
We lay on June the 6th. On June the 9th, we were supposed to take St. Lo. It took 6 weeks to take St. Lo, fighting through all those hedgerows.
Und wir haben versucht, so viel als möglich, ich will mal sagen, Krach zu machen, mit unseren Möglichkeiten, mit unseren Waffen. Wenn wir dann genug geschossen hatten, dann haben wir uns an dieser Stelle 50 oder 100 Meter zur nächsten Hecke, die ja immer lebensrettend waren für uns, die Hecken, sonst hätten wir dort überhaupt nicht überstanden. Dann haben wir uns wieder 50, 100 Meter zurückversetzt und die Amerikaner haben nun alles erstmal auf diesen Punkt gerichtet, wo wir vorher uns verteidigt haben. Und wir saßen dann 200, 300 Meter zurück.
During July, in a 2-week struggle to reach Saint-Lô, US 19th Corps suffered 11,000 casualties and advanced just 5 miles.
And we went into another field that the Germans had been dropping mortar shells in. That's when I saw my colonel, Colonel Terry. He just kept on walking, and then he was hit by a sniper, and he hit the ground. His helmet flew off, and he was dead. And about 20 minutes later, a half hour, I guess, I was hit by a piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell, and I was on my way back to England, too.
On the same day, Major Howe, commanding a battalion of the US 116th Infantry Regiment, assured his commander that his men would take Saint-Lô. Major Howe was killed moments later by an artillery shell. The following day, when his men finally captured the city, they laid his body, draped in the American flag, on the rubble of its cathedral. Lessons were learned from Saint-Lô, and Bradley decided to employ overwhelming firepower to give Operation Cobra every chance of success. Crucially, his attack would have the full support of the US 9th Tactical Air Command, around 400 aircraft. Operation Cobra would be led by 7th Corps of the US First Army, with 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions making the initial assault, to be followed up by 2nd Armoured and 1st Infantry, as well as units of 8th Corps. Standing by was General George Patton and US Third Army, ready to exploit any breakthrough made by First Army. Bradley's US First Army would launch Cobra at the same time as British Second Army's latest offensive against Caen, Operation Goodwood. On the 18th of July, Goodwood went ahead as planned, but Cobra had to be delayed when heavy cloud ruled out air support. The operation began a week late, at 9:30 a.m. on the 25th of July. The first phase of the attack was to be a massive bombing raid on German positions, in a box 4 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep. 1,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers rained more than 4,000 tons of high explosive on the target area.
There were so many bombers there that it was like a conveyor belt. And as far as you could see from here directly overhead, for as far as I could see with my binoculars, just bombers.
The elite Panzer Lehr division caught the brunt of the bombing, losing around 1,000 men, a third of its total strength.
The frontline troops who were really hit hard by these bombs, to use a First World War expression, they're completely shell-shocked and they're basically not able to function anymore. So it has a huge impact on the morale of these particular people.
Das ist eine Hölle. Das ist wie eine Hölle. Da bleiben sie still liegen und warten. Ergeben, sage ich jetzt mal in Anführungszeichen, auf das Ende oder darauf, dass es sie trifft. Sie merken das ja nicht. Ich meine, wenn sie in die Luft geschleudert werden, das sind sehr viele auch einfach in diesen Trichtern wieder nach unten gespült worden, sag ich mal, geworfen worden von der Wucht der Explosion.
It was one of the most devastating ground support missions of the war. But not all bombs hit the right target.
The winds had shifted. They were supposed to only drop their bombs into the markers that put off smoke in different colors, but they couldn't see them, and they were bombing our own men.
Quite a few of the bombs fell short. Indeed, 100 Americans were killed straight away. And one of these was General Leslie McNair, the most senior American ground commander to actually be killed during World War II.
Despite the friendly fire casualties, the bombers had done their job. The Air Force had blasted a 4-mile-wide hole in the German line. Now it was up to Bradley's US First Army to smash through it and begin the breakout before the Germans could recover. US infantry began their advance. They faced units commanded by a highly experienced German Field Marshal, Günther von Kluge. Von Kluge was a Prussian officer of the old school and a favorite of Hitler's for his performance during the invasions of France and the Soviet Union. In early July, he was appointed commander-in-chief in the West after Hitler sacked von Rundstedt, and he became commander of Army Group B as well when Field Marshal Rommel was injured in an Allied air attack. Hitler was counting on von Kluge for a miracle, but the veteran commander had bad news for the Führer.
He writes to Hitler almost immediately, saying exactly what von Rundstedt and Rommel had told Hitler a month before, that they're reaching the point at which they just can't hold the line. They're being worn out. They're running out of ammunition, they're running out of men.
Von Kluge was relying on 7th Army to deal with any American attack, but some of its units had been in almost constant combat since D-Day and were under strength and exhausted. All units were short of fuel and ammunition. Panzer Lehr Division, which had arrived in Normandy 6 weeks ago with more than 200 tanks, now had 31 left. But Panzer Lehr and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, were elite units and dangerous opponents in any circumstances. To add to von Kluge's problems, the devastating US air raid, followed by an intense artillery bombardment, made it almost impossible for him to communicate with forward units, or to find out what was happening at the front. By comparison, US forces brought cutting-edge technology to the battlefield that made their command and control significantly more effective.
This piece of American technology revolutionized battlefield communications. Unlike other armies which were still using radio sets with big long aerials which pointed directly to the radio operators and gave positions away, American commanders could now carry their own radios and be in direct contact with other units. The Germans, on the other hand, were still using First War technology. They'd failed to come up with a decent wireless technology before the Second World War. They were pretty much using field telephone sets with cables run out to all their command posts and headquarters. And of course, when the American aerial barrage started and the artillery started blasting their positions, those telephone cables were very quickly cut, and very soon they were out of contact with each other and weren't able to command their troops in the field.
And what's more, Allied forces were able to use radio communications to coordinate between ground and air forces.
This all started at St. Lo, when the Air Force bombed us at St. Lo twice. They had no control with the aircraft. They finally come up with air-ground control. And they formed the 9th Air Force, and the P-47s were designated to support the infantry. The Thunderbolt, I think it had 8 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, 8 of them. Big sucker, I mean, a real heavy-duty thing. And that was assigned mainly to the infantry. And when we called in strafe missions out in front, they go right over us and then open up when they get beyond. or they'd come in parallel with the front line.
But the new system did have its teething problems.
The American tanks had their own radios, but they were on a different frequency than the fighter bombers flying overhead. Because of that, the Americans had to put Air Force radio men in the tanks with special radios that could actually talk to the P-47 and P-51 pilots.
On the first day of Operation Cobra, US 7th Corps' progress was disappointing, just a mile and a half. But the next morning, General Bradley committed Sherman tanks of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions to the attack. Reports began to come in that past the front line, American troops were encountering only sporadic resistance. On the morning of the 3rd day, Commander of the 30th Infantry Division, General Hobbs, reported, "This thing has busted wide open." That same day, American troops had reached Coutances, Cerisy-la-Salle, and Villebaudon, and threatened to cut off half of German 7th Army in a pocket around Rancé. The trapped German units, including remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, tried to fight their way out under cover of darkness. They ran straight into US 2nd Armored, and after a night of furious, chaotic fighting, their columns were left decimated. Few managed to break through. In the face of the overwhelming US onslaught, on the ground and from the air, German 7th Army began to collapse.
Erst als nach diesen Bombardements der Durchbruch gelang und die Alliierten dann bis auf Orange vorstießen, haben wir geahnt, dass das also hier oben, dass wir hier nicht mehr lange bleiben würden. Ich habe an diesem Vorstoß gegen Orange teilgenommen, der wurde abgebrochen.
Germans began to surrender in droves, 7,000 in a single day. German prisoners blocking the roads were now causing more delay to the American advance than enemy resistance. On the 30th of July, US 4th Armored Division took Avranches, and the next day captured the strategically crucial bridge at Pont-au-Beau, intact. The bridge was the gateway to Brittany and beyond. Now was the time to unleash General Patton and US 3rd Army.
From early in his career, Patton had the idea that movement and fire were the main duties of a soldier. And if you weren't moving and you weren't firing, you weren't much of a soldier. Now he was going to have the opportunity to lead his 3rd Army across the river into Brittany, the big right hook which would help to unhinge the German defence and outflank the enemy.
In just 3 days, 7 US divisions crossed the bridge at Pont-au-Beau, heading west into Brittany, south towards the Loire River, and southeast towards Le Mans. In Brittany, German forces didn't hang around to face the Americans in open country, but withdrew to the heavily fortified Atlantic ports. Their heavy coastal guns, so well protected they were virtually immune to artillery and air attack, kept US forces at bay for weeks. While US infantry encircled the ports, Patton's armored divisions were free to resume their advance across the French countryside at astonishing speed. Key to the Americans' rapid advance was the use of mechanized forces.
This is one of the American half-tracks that were made in the Second World War. Just before the war began, the Americans had been experimenting, knowing that they were going to mechanize their army if a war came. And just before the war begins, they take the M2 front of a scout car and add it to a longer body with tracks on. Many different companies end up making variants of this half-track. And they get to the point that by the end of the war, the Americans have made 55,000 half-tracks like this. Propaganda from the Nazis make us believe that the Germans are the ones that have a fully mechanized force, when in actual fact, about 80% of their transport is actually managed by horses, not armored vehicles or trucks. They have 11 million horses in service, and that's how they actually get an awful lot of their supplies and men around the battlefield. And that contrast just shows the ability of the Americans to turn on a tap with their car and automotive industry to produce so many of these amazingly reliable, simple and effective vehicles.
Operation Cobra had been a complete success. Finally, after nearly 2 months pinned down in the Normandy Bocage, the Allies were on the move. Hitler was furious when he received news of the American breakout. 10 days before, on the 20th of July, he'd narrowly survived an assassination attempt when a bomb exploded at his headquarters in East Prussia. 4 soldiers had been killed, but the Führer escaped serious injury. Here he can be seen visiting some of the men seriously wounded by the blast. His would-be assassins turned out to be army officers.
By the Battle of Normandy, most German generals, including Rommel, knew that the war was lost, and they were looking desperately for some way to preserve Germany and their own militaristic life with the German army.
Hitler's fraught relationship with his generals sank to an all-time low.
A substantial number of them had been involved in the bomb plot, and so Hitler not only distrusted them, but began purging large swaths of the German high command.
Even Field Marshal Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was implicated in the plot.
He receives a visit by 2 German generals who take him in a car and put it to him that now might be a good idea to commit suicide, because if he didn't do that, he'd be taken to Berlin, would be interrogated, and we all know what that means. So he decides to commit suicide in the car as he's driving along with these 2 generals.
One of the effects of the purge that Hitler carried out after the July bomb plot was that it substantially reduced the number of experienced and effective generals he had to use on the Western Front. And so not only was Hitler micromanaging the military operations, he was also finding it hard to find someone who could command them effectively.
For weeks, German commanders in France, first von Rundstedt and Rommel, now von Kluge, had pleaded with Hitler for permission to withdraw from Normandy to a new defensive line along the Seine River. Now it was the only realistic option left. But to Field Marshal von Kluge's horror, Hitler instead ordered a counterattack. Hitler told von Kluge to gather the last few panzer divisions in Normandy and attack from Mortain towards the coast at Avranches to cut off Patton's Third Army to the south. The counterattack was codenamed Lüttich. But the Allies knew it was coming, thanks to their ability to decode German military communications sent using their famous Enigma machine, a top-secret intelligence source known as Ultra. But this time, warning of the German counterattack, led by 150 tanks and elite units of the Waffen-SS, didn't reach American frontline units until the last minute. In desperate fighting around Mortain, a battalion of the US 30th Infantry Division, dug into Hill 314, was surrounded. Despite heavy losses, they held their ground, using their vantage point to call in artillery and airstrikes on the German armor. American and British fighter bombers made pass after pass. Within 24 hours, the German offensive had been stopped in its tracks. Worse, Hitler's intervention had left his forces vulnerable to an Allied counterstrike. The best German divisions were now concentrated at the western tip of an exposed salient. Montgomery saw the potential for a huge envelopment of German forces in Normandy. Patton, advancing rapidly towards Chartres and Orléans, was ordered to divert one corps north to Argenton, while the newly formed Canadian First Army would push south towards high ground overlooking the town of Falaise. The advance, codenamed Operation Totalize, was to be led by Major General Guy Simonds' Canadian Second Corps, made up of Canadian, British and Polish forces. Their first obstacle was the formidable Verrières Ridge, where 2 previous attempts to break through had already failed, at a cost of nearly 3,000 casualties. Simmons planned an aerial bombardment to prepare the way for a mechanized assault. But with a shortage of armored personnel carriers, the dilemma was how to protect the infantry.
One of the problems the Allies faced early in the Normandy campaign was when the tanks advanced, they sometimes lost contact with the infantry. So the Canadian commander came up with a brilliant suggestion. Let's take some redundant self-propelled artillery, basically artillery pieces on a tank chassis, take the guns out, plate over the front, and we'll make a heavily armoured personnel carrier. And they used that for the first time as part of Operation Totalize, having a section of infantry in a tracked armoured vehicle that can keep up with the tanks going forward. And that leads to the innovation of taking redundant tanks, such as this ram tank, the turret is taken off, and a section of 8 infantry could be carried in here with 2 crew members in the front as well. And that means they've got a level of protection as they go forward into battle that other soldiers just don't have.
Ian Hamilton from Kent was a tank commander and fought from D-Day to the end of the war.
Operation Totalize was pushed out to take place at night. There would be an RAF night bomber Lancaster bombing raid on the German lines first. That would be followed by all the Allied ground artillery following up with a huge barrage, and then we went in at night at around about 11 o'clock. It was pitch black. It was a pitch black night.
As the bombardment was lifted, the mechanized columns moved forward, feeling their way to their objectives through the darkness.
The attack was going to be all on tracks, tanks, and the infantry would come later. It was arranged for 4 lines of tanks, led by flails in case we came across minefields. And to help us on our way, a Bofors anti-aircraft gun would fire bursts of 5 rounds of tracer. So it gave him his direction.
Thanks to careful planning, the Canadian night attack was a success, and Verrières Ridge was in Allied hands by noon. Tanks were then sent forward to exploit the breakthrough. In the lead, the Canadian 4th Armoured and Polish 1st Armoured Divisions. As the battle became more confused, friendly fire once more became a serious hazard, as Allied aircraft hit friend and foe alike.
So I looked up, here they're coming, a whole gang of them. I said, boy. So I just took my helmet off, and I give them hell, boys. And then I clapped the helmet back on fast because the bomb doors opened, and here's the bombs whistle coming down. I looked over, there was a little German slit trench that the German had dug, and I dove in there like a rabbit.
The largest number of casualties from this friendly fire was from the 1st Polish Armoured Division.
The coalition of forces under Eisenhower for the campaign in Northwest Europe didn't just consist of the British, the Americans, and the Canadians. There were other nationalities involved with their own ways of fighting and their own political ambitions. 2nd French Armoured Division played the leading part in liberating Paris for political reasons. There were also forces from Belgium, from the Netherlands, and from Norway. And perhaps the most extraordinary fighting division on the Allied side was 1st Polish Armoured Division, made up of Poles who had either escaped from the country in 1939 or later, or who had come from around the world to fight for Poland. They had been equipped by the British, and they fought as part of 1st Canadian Army.
The Germans were terrified of Polish troops out to settle scores.
He was a young Hitler Youth chap, and we caught him through the knee. We got as much out of him as we could, but he wasn't in a fit state, really. So I thought he needs some medical attention, and the Polish Armoured Division were just about to move through us for the next phase of the attack. So I walked to a half-track with a Red Cross on, spoke to the doctor and said, I've got a man here who needs attention. And he sent 2 of his men with a stretcher, and he plonked it down beside this boy, because he was 15. And they bent down to pick him up, to put him on it, and he saw their flash, Poland. He did not want to go with them. 9, said. But they picked him up anyway and dunked him on the stretcher and carried him off. I've often wondered what happened to him.
It was 12th SS Panzer, the infamous Hitler Youth Division, that now led the German counterattack against Operation Totalize. They were supported by 7 Tiger tanks, led by famous SS tank ace, Michael Wittmann. The Allies had once regarded these heavy German tanks as almost unstoppable, but now they had a weapon that was able to take them on.
One of the problems the British had was how to fit their new 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a tank. So as an improvisation, they got the 17-pounder, squeezed it into the Sherman. Now the 17-pounder gun, when it was firing, discarding sabot ammunition, that meant it had greater penetration on it than the Tiger's 88mm gun. With the British attack in Operation Totalize, they'd advanced overnight and they spread themselves out either side of the main Caen to Falaise road. Now the Germans, naturally, it's in their doctrine, they react to that attack very quickly and put in a counterattack. Wittmann, in his Tiger tanks, drives up the middle of the road between 2 sets of woods on either side. As Wittmann's Tigers head up the main Caen to Falaise road, he's taken on by the tanks of the Northants Yeomanry. A young gunner, Joe Eakins, is in one of these Fireflies, and he drives the tank out of the wood, takes on the rear German Tiger. He then works his way along the line of German vehicles, and at the same time, from the other side of the valley, fire is coming in from the Canadian tanks. Now, there seems a slight irony about this communal effort of the British and the Canadian forces taking out what is the German propaganda icon, Michael Wittmann, this famous SS tank ace.
The following day, the 9th of August, Canadian troops pushed on towards Falaise. The Germans were now in a desperate situation, but fought ferociously for Kenney Woods and Hill 195.
Well, we lost a bunch of guys as it was. We had about 20 killed. Our sergeant, he was at my side, or not too far away from me one minute, and the next minute he was gone. I didn't know what had happened to him.
Adair's unit was forced to pull back. In fact, despite its early successes, Totalize had ground to a halt all along the line. Allied commanders hoped to seal off German forces in a pocket by taking Falaise. So far, they'd not been able to close the trap. But Simmons wasn't done yet. By the 14th of August, British, Canadian, and Polish troops were ready for a new push, an attack that Allied commanders hoped would seal the fate of German forces in Normandy. Hitler, meanwhile, seemed interested only in ordering more futile counterattacks. It wasn't until the last moment that he finally accepted the danger of encirclement and authorized a retreat. Nevertheless, he sacked the man who'd been urging this course of action for weeks, his commander in the West, Field Marshal von Kluge.
Convinced that Kluge had failed him, and also that the reason for Kluge's absence from his headquarters might have been that he was negotiating with the Allies, Hitler summoned him back to Berlin. Kluge knew he was doomed. He wrote a long, rambling letter explaining why this was not his fault and blaming everybody else he could think of, and he committed suicide.
On the 19th of August, the Polish 1st Armored Division made contact with the US 90th Infantry Division at Chambois, and the trap closed around 15 German divisions. For 2 days, elite German SS units and paratroopers fought to force open an escape corridor, all the while under relentless Allied bombardment.
It's terrible. You can't, you know, there's no way of describing it, especially at Falaise there, the noise in that. All those gunfire, that steady roar all the time, you know, and you're trying to, well, you couldn't hear commands. You just followed and hoped you were going in the right direction.
RAF Typhoons flew sortie after sortie, wreaking havoc on the cornered German forces. First tested in 1940, this powerful single-seater fighter-bomber was a challenge for even skilled pilots.
Just to give an example, a Hurricane motor was about 1,300 horsepower. This motor in the Typhoon was 2,400 horsepower. So it was a monster of a big fighter. And a Hurricane weighed about 2.5 tons. The Typhoon weighed 7 tons. It was a big aircraft.
The Typhoon packed a devastating punch of 4 20mm cannon and 8 unguided rockets, each with a 60-pound warhead.
We'd dive in at probably 50, 60 degrees, or get down around 2,000 feet or 3,000 feet. Fire your rockets, fire your cannon, and when you got too close to the ground, you started to pull out.
On the 21st of August, the Allies closed off the last escape route. And from all sides, the encircled German 7th Army was subjected to an unrelenting barrage of artillery fire and air attack. For German soldiers, the Falaise pocket became hell on earth. Thousands were killed. The survivors, 50,000 of them, surrendered. Soldiers on both sides were sickened by the slaughter.
I want to go home. Home, he kept saying home, home. I knew what he was thinking. Same thing I was thinking. Let's get this damn thing over and get back home. See?
We would give them cigarettes and water or wherever they wanted. We didn't have any animosity towards them. We did a little bit of looting, taking their watches and money or whatever they had. We thought that was all right. We didn't see anything wrong with that. But we respected those guys because they did what they had to do. When it was over, they were just as glad it was over, and we were glad that they were quitting too.
Those who surrendered left behind the bodies of 10,000 comrades, as well as hundreds of abandoned vehicles and guns, and thousands of horses used as transport by an army that had run out of fuel.
Awful chaos for all the Germans. I mean, they had the numbers of equipment and dead people all over the place, vehicles wrecked.
If we felt any pity for the Germans, we felt it then, because they were it was like a slaughterhouse.
When you got to the Falaise Gap, you started to feel very sorry for them, because they'd been trapped by silly orders from Hitler, and you began to feel, I mean, the most terrible thing. But I mean, there were some very fanatical soldiers, and you knew they would show no mercy.
When Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower visited the battlefield, he described it as unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. It was possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. There was more bad news for Hitler. At the height of the Battle of Falaise, the Allies landed 150,000 troops in southern France in a huge amphibious operation codenamed Dragoon.
The strategic result of the breakout toward Falaise and then Paris, and the landing of American forces in southern France in Operation Dragoon, was to completely destroy any German hopes of holding on to France. As a result, what was really going on was a rout. German forces were simply trying to get eastward as fast as possible to a place where they could set up any kind of defensive line.
As the Falaise pocket collapsed, Patton's units were already establishing bridgeheads across what German commanders hoped would be their next defensive line, the Seine River. Patton's main problem was no longer German resistance, it was keeping his forward units supplied with fuel. Across France, Allied troops were now advancing faster than the Germans had with their blitzkrieg invasion of 1940, liberating more villages and towns every day.
The French population were beside themselves with love, kindness, kisses, wine, booze, oranges. They had a nasty habit, didn't mean us, of throwing fruit at us. And there were a lot of tank crews with black eyes from apples and the all meant very well. And screaming, loving it, singing the Marseillaise, singing Hallelujah, God Save the King, anything that they could think of. We'd never come across it before.
But the terrible destruction and suffering caused by Allied bombing left some locals with mixed feelings towards their liberators.
People were so jubilant when you got there, except the French were a little bit, but we could understand that. They'd suffered heavily in the bombardment of Normandy, so I don't think they particularly liked us all that much at that stage. But then later on, they got very friendly.
The French capital posed a particular challenge for Allied commanders. While not a strategic target, Paris was a political prize, and its liberation had symbolic value.
Eisenhower decided to liberate Paris, but he made the critical mistake of not allowing the one French armored division under General Leclerc to lead the charge into the city. Leclerc decided to disobey orders, stole a march on the rest of his allies, and entered Paris as the leading unit of the Allied Liberation Force.
As shooting broke out on the streets between French resistance and the German garrison, the German governor of Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, had a decision to make.
Hitler had ordered him to hold Paris to the last man, and if necessary, burn the whole city down. But Choltitz didn't want to do that, and he defied Hitler and made the decision to surrender Paris rather than defending it to the death.
There was, to a degree, admiration for French culture, French society, the French language. So he didn't really want to carry out this order. There's also another reason, of course, why he decided not to do that, is because just like anyone who was of open and clear mind, he did realize that Germany would no longer be able to win the war. And there was just a completely scorched earth policy for no absolutely military or any other reason whatsoever. And of course, he also did realize that if he did carry out that order and was then later captured by the Allies, that would not look particularly good and reflect particularly well on his performance. So he was trying to cover his own back to a degree as well.
On the 25th of August, after 4 years of Nazi occupation, Paris was liberated.
There were still many German snipers behind, but our movement was onto the Champs-Élysées, just beyond the Arc de Triomphe, and we would come on German snipers in apartment buildings and had to fire at them. But also, the French weren't worried about that. They were trying to greet us and greet their countrymen who had come with General Leclerc's army. And it was a joyous occasion. The French ladies were generous with their flowers and their kisses, and we fought it off the best we could.
2 months of attritional warfare in Normandy were behind the Allies. The long-awaited breakout, which began with Operation Cobra, had triggered a collapse in the German army in France. And within days, Eisenhower would be looking at plans to push on to Germany itself. But many more hard battles lay ahead. The German army remained a formidable enemy, experienced, well-led, and now fighting to defend its homeland from invasion.